Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Something is very wrong with the houses in Kentucky. Families move in happy, but they run out screaming in the middle of the night. Tonight I have 8 real stories that will make you check every corner of your room. These aren't just ghost stories. People got hurt, people went missing, and some houses are still empty because no one dares to live there. Hit subscribe now before something stops you and smash that like button. Comment below if you're watching alone. Ready or not, let's enter these cursed houses. I'm 32 and I've been driving for Instacart around eastern Kentucky for about 3 years now. My daughter Sophia was born with a cleft palate, and even with insurance, we're looking at close to $5,000 out of pocket for her surgery and medications. When you're staring down that kind of debt, you take every delivery that pops up on your phone, even the ones that send you deep into the hollers where most folks won't go. This particular order came through on a Tuesday night in November, around 9:30. I was sitting in the Walmart parking lot in Whitesburg, about to call it a night, when the notification popped up. Delivery to Harlan County, 47 jars of Gerber baby food, 20 pounds of ground beef from the meat counter, and 6 bottles of hydrogen peroxide. Customer name, Mrs. Patterson. The address showed a farmhouse about 40 minutes into the mountains, and she'd already tipped $200. $200. That was exactly what I needed for Sophia's prescription copay. My mama always told me stories about the old families back in these mountains, the ones who'd been here since before the coal companies, before the logging operations, families with names that showed up on deeds going back to when Kentucky was still part of Virginia. She said some of them weren't quite right anymore, that being isolated for generations had changed them in ways that weren't natural. I thought about those stories as I loaded up my Honda and headed south on Route 119. The delivery instructions were simple enough. Leave groceries on front porch. Do not ring doorbell or knock. Payment and tip already processed. Fine by me. Drop and go is always easier, especially this late at night. The drive into Harlan County takes you through some of the most beautiful and lonesome country in Kentucky. Mountain ridges that look black against the sky, hollers so deep and you can't see the bottom even in daylight. My GPS worked fine until I turned off onto an unmarked gravel road, then just went dead. No signal, no satellite connection, nothing. But there was a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper that hadn't been there when I got in the car. It was a hand-drawn map done in blue ballpoint pen on what looked like old ledger paper. It showed exactly where to go. Past a mailbox shot full of holes, around a switchback marked Dead Oak, through a rusted gate that was supposed to be standing open. At the bottom, in careful cursive handwriting, it said, "Thank you kindly for coming so far. Mrs. P." I followed that map deeper into the mountains, my headlights cutting through fog that seemed to get thicker with every mile. The road got so narrow in places that tree branches scraped both sides of my car. I kept thinking about Sophia's surgery, about how this one delivery would cover her medicine and maybe give us a little breathing room. That $200 tip felt like a godsend. The Patterson place sat in a little clearing about 3 miles past where any reasonable road should have ended. 2-story white farmhouse, probably built in the 1920s, with a wraparound porch and gingerbread trim under the eaves. Looked normal enough from a distance, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard about mountain heritage. But as I pulled into the dirt driveway, my headlights picked up details that made my skin crawl. Every single window in the house was painted black from the inside, not curtains or boards, thick black paint completely covering the glass. And the front porch was carpeted with dead flies. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, all arranged in perfect spirals and geometric patterns like some kind of insect mandala. They covered every inch of the porch floor, but there wasn't a single fly anywhere else. Out on the steps, not on the railings, just those precise designs covering the boards. I grabbed the grocery bags and walked up to the porch, trying to step between the fly patterns. The silence was complete. No night sounds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, like the air itself was too thick. That's when I noticed the other delivery bags. 3 sets of groceries sat by the front door, obviously been there for weeks. The bags were split open and crawling with maggots, but the receipts were all dated within the last few days. Different drivers: Tony Martinez, Sarah Chen, Marcus Williams. I knew all 3 of them from the driver app chat groups. Tony had been missing for 2 weeks. Sarah's car had been found abandoned on Highway 421 6 days ago. Marcus just stopped responding to messages 3 days back. I set down the new groceries and turned to leave, but that's when I heard the babies crying inside the house. Not one baby. A whole nursery full of them, all crying at different pitches and rhythms like some horrible symphony. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing up from the basement, down from the 2nd floor, through the painted black windows. My van wouldn't start. I turned the key and got nothing but clicking. Popped the hood to check the battery connections and nearly threw up right there in the driveway. The entire engine compartment was packed with raw meat. The same ground beef I'd just delivered, but wet and warm despite the November cold. It pulsed like it was breathing. "Miguel, honey, you made it." I spun around. Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway, and she looked exactly like what you'd expect. Maybe 55 years old, gray-streaked brown hair in a neat bun, wearing a faded flower print dress and a cardigan. Could have been anybody's Meemaw, the kind of woman who'd send you home with a bag of green beans from her garden and ask about your family. But her shadow was wrong. The porch light cast her silhouette on the wall behind her, and instead of an old woman, it showed some. Eating hunched and twisted, with too many limbs and what looked like a long tail dragging behind it. And when she smiled at me, her teeth were all different sizes and shapes, like she'd collected them from different people. "You're right on time, sweetie," she said, her voice warm and grandmotherly. "I was just getting the nursery ready. Come help me with something heavy downstairs." Her mouth didn't move right when she talked. The words were coming from her, but her lips moved a half-second behind, like watching a badly dubbed movie. And then the smell hit me. Rotting meat and sour milk and something else, something chemical and wrong that made my eyes water. I tried to back away, but my legs started walking toward the house on their own. Not like something was controlling me, but like they'd forgotten how to obey my brain. They carried me up the porch steps, past those spirals of dead flies, through the front door. The inside of the house looked like it had been decorated sometime in the 1950s and never changed. Floral wallpaper, doilies on every surface, family photos in heavy wooden frames covering the walls. But everything was slightly too small, the ceilings too low, the doorways too narrow, like the whole place had been built for people 6 inches shorter than normal. The family photos showed Mrs. Patterson with different men over what looked like decades, maybe longer. In the early pictures, the men looked happy, healthy, normal. But as you moved along the wall, they got thinner and paler, their smiles more forced. The last few photos just showed Mrs. Patterson standing next to what looked like scarecrows made of stretched skin. She led me through a living room where 47 high chairs sat in perfect rows, each one with a little pile of human teeth scattered underneath like spilled cereal. Baby teeth, adult teeth, some still bloody at the roots. "The bays are downstairs," Mrs. Patterson said, opening a door that led to the basement. "They're so very hungry, and they've been waiting for their dinner." The basement stairs were wrong. They started out normal width, but got narrower as they went down, until I had to turn sideways to fit through. By the time we reached the bottom, I was crawling on my hands and knees through what felt like a birth canal made of rotting wood. The basement was impossible. It stretched way beyond what the house's footprint should have allowed. Huge as a high school gymnasium, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. Hundreds of cribs filled the space in neat rows, old-fashioned wooden ones with bars like jail cells. And in each crib was a grown man, curled up in the fetal position, alive, but unable to speak or move. Feeding tubes ran down from the ceiling into their mouths, pumping something dark and thick into their stomachs. Tony Martinez was in the 3rd row from the left. He looked at me with eyes full of terror and recognition, his belly swollen like he was 9 months pregnant with something that kept moving and shifting under his skin. Next to him was Sarah Chen, and beyond her, Marcus Williams. All of them conscious, all of them aware, all of them trapped in those cribs like oversized babies. That's when Mrs. Patterson's face split open. It cracked down the middle like a broken egg, and inside were rows and rows of tiny mouths, each one full of needle-sharp baby teeth. Every mouth was speaking in a different voice, some in English, some in languages I'd never heard. But they were all saying the same thing. Hungry baby needs food. Hungry baby needs daddy. She leaned over one of the baby food jars I'd delivered and started vomiting into it. Not regular vomit, thick black liquid that moved on its own, forming little tentacles that reached up toward the rim of the jar. The smell was like everything rotten you could imagine mixed together and left in the sun for weeks. Then the men in the cribs started convulsing. Their swollen bellies split open like a ripe fruit, and things crawled out. Baby-sized versions of Mrs. Patterson, but with too many arms and legs and those same rows of tiny, sharp teeth. They skittered across the floor toward me, all speaking in my daughter's voice. "Daddy, we're hungry. Feed us, Daddy. We need our medicine, Daddy." I understood then what this place really was. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Mrs. Patterson wasn't one creature, but a colony, like a hive of bees or a nest of termites, and every baby was another mouth to feed the whole. The grocery deliveries were bait, carefully chosen to attract specific types of prey. They'd profiled me perfectly. Desperate father, needed money, would go anywhere for the right price. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but the screen showed something impossible. According to the delivery app, I was still driving, still making deliveries in real time. My family wouldn't worry. As far as the world knew, I was having a normal night at work. But I remembered something. The hydrogen peroxide. My mama had always said hydrogen peroxide could clean anything, kill any infection. I grabbed the bottles from where I'd dropped the grocery bags and started pouring them into Mrs. Patterson's split-open face. She screamed, and it wasn't one voice but dozens, all hitting different notes in perfect harmony. The house itself started convulsing around us. The walls began bleeding actual blood, thick and dark, and the floor turned soft and pink like the inside of a mouth. The whole place was digesting us. Some of the men in the cribs started waking up as whatever drug was in those feeding tubes got diluted. A few were too far gone, their bodies just empty sacks of skin. But Tony's eyes were still alert. I grabbed him under the arms and started dragging him toward the stairs while digestive acid ate through our clothes and skin. The crawl space back to the main floor felt like being born in reverse. We squeezed through that narrowing passage while the house contracted around us, trying to push us back down into its stomach. I could hear Mrs. Patterson behind us, or what was left of her, making sounds like a garbage disposal full of broken glass. Upstairs, I kicked in the bedroom door and found her, the real Mrs. Patterson. Her skeleton sat in a rocking chair by the window, still wearing a moldy nightgown, still holding a baby blanket that had rotted to threads. She'd been dead for years, maybe decades. The thing downstairs had killed her and taken her place, learning to mimic her well enough to order groceries and pay bills and keep the electricity on. In the dresser drawer, I found property deeds going back to 1823, all owned by women named Mrs. Patterson, all signed with the exact same signature in the exact same blue ink. The original deed was signed by one Constance Patterson, but there were notes in the margins written in different hands. Constance passed 1847, Mary Patterson, new owner. Mary passed 1871, Elizabeth Patterson, new owner. On and on, every 20 or 30 years, a new Mrs. Patterson taking over, all with the same signature, like the same hand had been signing documents for 200 years. Tony and I made it to my van. The meat was gone from the engine, and it started up like nothing had ever been wrong. We drove straight back to Whitesburg, to the state police post on Main Street. Told them everything, the house, the colony creature, the missing drivers. They sent a team out the next morning, but all they found was an empty lot with some old foundation stones and a hand-dug well that went down farther than their equipment could measure. The missing drivers were never found. Officially, they just vanished while making deliveries in remote areas. Happens more often than you'd think in eastern Kentucky. Tony moved away 2 weeks later, said he couldn't stand the sound of babies crying anymore. I don't blame him. 3 days after everything happened, the Children's Hospital called. Assured. Sophia's surgery and all her follow-up care had been paid for in full by an anonymous donor. When I pressed them for details, they said the payment came from an account registered to a Mrs. Patterson in Harlan County, but when they tried to send a thank you letter, the bank said no such account existed. Sophia's surgery went perfectly. She's 5 now, and you'd never know she'd been born with a cleft palate except for a tiny scar on her upper lip. Sometimes I catch her playing with her dolls, feeding them pretend food and saying "hungry baby" in a sing-song voice, and I have to leave the room. I still drive for Instacart, but I don't take orders in Harlan County anymore. Don't matter how much they tip. And every few months, I'll get a notification for a delivery to a Mrs. Patterson somewhere in the mountains. Different counties, different addresses, but always that same careful cursive handwriting in the special instructions. Thank you kindly for coming so far. I always decline those orders. To this day, I won't buy baby food for any reason. Sophia's 5 years old and can eat regular food now, but even walking past that aisle in the grocery store makes my hands shake. Because I know somewhere out there in the Kentucky mountains, there's still a house that needs feeding, and it's still placing orders, and sooner or later some other desperate parent is going to need that money bad enough to make the drive. My mama always said the old families in these mountains weren't quite right anymore. She was right about that. But she never told me some of them weren't families at all. Just something old and hungry wearing a family's name, placing grocery orders and waiting for the next delivery driver to come too far into the hollers to find their way back out. I keep Sophia's surgery photos in my wallet now, the before and after pictures. Reminds me that sometimes taking the devil's money works out okay in the end, as long as you're smart enough and lucky enough to walk away from the table while you still can. But late at night, when I'm checking her room to make sure she's still sleeping in her own bed and not curled up in some impossible crib underground, I wonder if Mrs. Patterson is still out there somewhere, signing deeds with that same blue ink, learning new names, adapting to DoorDash and Uber Eats and whatever comes next. The mountains keep their secrets, and some secrets keep themselves fed. I'm 48 years old, and I've been fixing appliances for most of my adult life. Started right out of high school, working for my uncle's repair shop in eastern Kentucky before eventually going out on my own. It's honest work, pays the bills, and I know these machines inside and out. Problem is, when you're self-employed and your kid needs surgery, you take whatever jobs come your way, even the ones that don't feel quite right from the start. My son Danny had been having seizures since he was 12. The doctors finally figured out it was something they could fix with surgery, but insurance was only covering part of it. I needed $8,000, and I needed it fast. That's when I got the call about the old Whitmore place up in the hills outside Harlan County. The voice on the phone was polite but strange, like someone reading from a script they didn't quite understand. Said they had an industrial freezer acting up in their basement, needed it fixed right away, and were willing to pay triple my usual emergency rate. Cash. The caller claimed to be Mr. Chen, the new owner, but something about the way he pronounced certain words made my skin crawl. Still, Danny's surgery was scheduled for the following month, and I was still $3,000 short. The Whitmore mansion had been empty for 15 years before this Chen fellow bought it. 3-story colonial sitting on maybe 50 acres of wooded land, the kind of place that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. Old mining family built it in the 1920s, back when coal money flowed like water through these hills. But the Whitmores had a reputation. Folks in town still whispered about strange disappearances around their property, going back generations. As I pulled into the circular driveway, something felt immediately wrong. The windows were all dark except for one on the second floor, and there wasn't a single car in sight besides my truck. The afternoon sun was shining bright, but shadows around the house seemed too deep, too dark. Even the birds had gone quiet. I knocked on the front door and waited. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until an intercom crackled to life. "Mr. Patterson?" The voice was thin, hollow-sounding through the speaker. "Thank you for coming. The basement entrance is around back. The electrical situation is, complicated up here." "I'd prefer to come in the front way," I said. "Need to check your main panel first, make sure I'm not dealing with a power issue that's affecting the unit." "The basement entrance, please. Everything you need is downstairs. I'll meet you there shortly." There was something in that voice that made me want to get back in my truck and drive home. But Danny's face flashed in my mind, pale and thin after another seizure. And I walked around back. The basement door was already open, heavy steel painted black, leading down into darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. I called out hello, but the only response was a faint echo that sounded wrong, like it was coming from much farther away than the space should have allowed. The basement was wrong from the moment I stepped into it. First thing I noticed was the size. It stretched out way beyond the foundation of the house above, extending in directions that made no geometric sense. My footsteps echoed differently as I moved through different sections, sometimes sharp and immediate, sometimes muffled like I was walking through cotton. The ceiling height changed randomly as I walked. One section forced me to duck under a 6-foot clearance, while the next opened up into a cathedral-like space that disappeared into shadows above my flashlight beam. The walls were stone in some places, concrete in others, and something that looked almost organic in the darker core. NURS, pale and slightly damp to the touch. 12 industrial freezers were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room. All of them were humming steadily except one, a massive unit that looked like it belonged in a morgue or medical facility. The work order said it had a temperature regulation issue, running too cold, but as I approached, I realized the air around it was actually warm. There was a drain in the exact center of the circle, about 3 feet across, with a heavy iron grate. The metal was stained dark around the edges, and a sweet, rotten smell was rising from whatever lay below. I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. The odor reminded me of fruit left too long in summer heat, but underneath it was something else, something metallic and wrong. I set my toolbox down and pulled out my thermometer. The ambient air in most of the basement read a normal 65 degrees, but as I moved closer to the supposedly broken freezer, the temperature started climbing. By the time I reached the unit, it was reading 85 degrees. That's when I noticed the sounds. Faint at first, coming from the other freezers. A rhythmic scratching from unit number 2, like fingernails on metal. Breathing sounds from number 3, slow and deliberate. Condensation forming and disappearing on the inside of the glass door. Number 4 was shaking slightly, just barely perceptible. Something large shifting around inside. I checked the temperature gauges on each unit. They all read -40 degrees, but the frost patterns on the doors told a different story. No frost at all on most of them, and the ones that had any showed melting and refreezing patterns that suggested the interiors were actually hot. The locks were all on the outside, heavy-duty deadbolts that looked recently installed. Around the handles, I could see deep scratches in the metal, gouges that looked like something had been trying to escape from within. I was starting to get that crawling feeling between my shoulder blades, the one that tells you you're being watched. But every time I turned around, the basement was empty, just shadows and the constant humming of the 11 working freezers. I opened my toolbox and pulled out my voltage tester, figuring I'd start with basic electrical diagnostics. That's when I heard the voice. "Help!" It was barely a whisper, coming from inside the broken freezer. I pressed my ear against the door and heard it again. Weaker this time. "Please." My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to get back in my truck and drive away, but that voice sounded so desperate, so human. I opened the freezer. What I saw inside still gives me nightmares. It wasn't food. It wasn't anything that should have been in a freezer. The entire interior was filled with human hands, left hands, all of them, hanging from hooks like sides of meat in a butcher shop. But these weren't severed hands. They were growing from fleshy stalks that emerged from the back wall of the unit, connected by pale, vein-like tubes that pulsed with dark fluid. Each hand had a small tag attached with wire showing dates and what looked like cultivation notes. Some of the dates went back to the 1940s. The hands closest to me were still warm despite the freezing temperature, and I could see them moving slightly, fingers twitching like they were trying to communicate. The wedding ring on the hand nearest the door was familiar. Gold band with a small scratch near the knuckle. I'd seen it before on Tom Bradley, another repair tech who'd gone missing about 6 months ago. Police figured he'd fallen in the river somewhere remote. His wife still posted about him on Facebook, begging for any information. As I stared in horror, the hands began moving more deliberately. The fingers were spelling something on the interior glass. H-E-L-P, then C-O-L-D. Then, in letters that made my blood freeze, K-I-L-L-U-S. That is when I heard footsteps on the stairs. "Mr. Patterson." The voice was different now, closer, without the hollow intercom distortion. "I apologize for keeping you waiting." I spun around and saw him descending the last few steps. Mr. Chen looked normal at first glance. Middle-aged Asian man in a well-tailored business suit, carrying himself with quiet authority. But something was wrong with the way he moved, too fluid, like his joints weren't quite in the right places. "I see you've discovered our little cultivation project," he said, stepping into the circle of freezers. His voice had an odd quality, like it was coming from somewhere behind him rather than his mouth. "What the hell is this?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking. "Those are people. That's Tom Bradley's hand." Indeed, Mr. Bradley was very cooperative in the end, as were the others. Chen gestured toward the other freezers with one arm, and I noticed his sleeve was too long, like the arm inside it had extra joints. "You see, this house has a very particular history. The Whitmore family understood what this land demanded. They fed it for generations until they grew careless and the authorities became interested. But the needs of this place don't simply disappear because the humans above ground forget about them." He pressed something on a small remote, and the other freezers began opening with pneumatic hisses. The contents spilled out onto the concrete floor in a nightmare parade of preserved human parts. Arms crawling along using their fingers like legs, feet walking without bodies attached, heads rolling and trying to speak with frozen tongues, their eyes still aware, still pleading. But these weren't random body parts. They were moving with purpose, searching for something, trying to reassemble themselves into complete beings. A torso pulled itself along with muscular arms toward a pair of legs that were walking in circles. A head rolled determinedly toward a neck stump that was leaking dark fluid. "The land beneath this house is hungry, Mr. Patterson. It has been hungry for a very long time. The Whitmores understood that feeding it kept it satisfied, kept it from expanding its appetite. But when they disappeared, the hunger grew." Chen walked among the crawling parts without concern, occasionally nudging one with his foot to redirect its path. Up close, I could see that his face was wrong. The features were human, but they sat on his skull like a mask that didn't quite fit properly. "I am what you might call a curator. I maintain the collection, ensure proper preservation, and facilitate the feeding schedule. But the process requires fresh genetic material, new templates for the growing." He pulled out a thick folder from his jacket, though I swear the jacket hadn't had pockets a moment before. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings, all missing person reports from across eastern Kentucky. The dates went back 60 years. "Your son's surgery," Chen said, reading my thoughts somehow. "The hospital recommendation came through very specific channels. You have particular genetic markers that are compatible with our needs." That's when I felt it. A cold numbness starting in my left hand and creeping up my arm. I looked down and saw that my hand was turning pale, the skin taking on a waxy, preserved appearance. "The air you've been breathing contains a mild paralytic derived from certain fungi that grow in the deeper levels beneath us. Nothing harmful, simply preparatory." My hand was moving without my control now, reaching toward the open freezer. But as it got closer, the harvested hands inside began reaching back, not to grab me, but to push me away, trying to warn me. The hand wearing Tom Bradley's ring managed to grab my wrist, and I felt a shock of cold that cleared my head for a moment. In that instant of clarity, I understood. The preserved parts weren't the real threat. They were victims trying to save me from joining them. The real danger was what was underneath us. Chen's pleasant mask was slipping now, literally. His facial features were sliding around like they were projected onto water. Behind the false face, something else was looking out, something with too many eyes in configurations that hurt to perceive directly. "The basement is just the upper level," he said, his voice now coming from multiple directions at once. "The real estate extends much, much deeper. This entire mountain is hollow, Mr. Patterson. Has been for millennia. We simply maintain the surface facilities." The floor around the central drain was starting to crack, pieces of concrete falling away to reveal darkness that seemed to move and breathe. The sweet, rotten smell was getting stronger, and I could hear sounds rising from below. Not quite animal, not quite human, but hungry. My left arm was completely numb now, but I could still feel my right hand. I managed to grab my repair torch from my toolbox, the one I used for copper pipework. The blue flame caught Chen's attention immediately. "Heat," he said, his voice showing the first sign of concern. "Uncontrolled heat damages the preservation process." I aimed the torch at the nearest freezer, and the effect was immediate. The harvested hands inside began screaming, actually screaming with voices that sounded like Tom Bradley, like Jim Morrison, like all the missing repair techs who'd answered similar calls. But they weren't screaming in pain. They were screaming warnings. "The drain! Watch the drain!" The concrete around the central opening was cracking faster now, chunks falling into darkness that had no bottom. Something was climbing up from below, something that made Chen look normal by comparison. I turned the torch toward the ceiling, targeting the support beams. The old wood caught fire immediately and the sprinkler system activated, but instead of water, a thick, dark fluid began raining down. Where it touched the preserved body parts, they dissolved like salt in acid. Chen shrieked and dove toward the drain, his human disguise falling away completely. What I saw in those last seconds still haunts me. Something like a spider made of human skin, with faces embedded in its surface. All of them people who'd gone missing over the decades. The ceiling was coming down, and I ran for the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of the entire basement collapsing, the freezers crashing down into whatever hungry darkness waited below. I made it to my truck and drove away, but the numbness in my left hand never went away. Sometimes late at night it moves on its own, writes warnings on fogged windows or leaves notes I don't remember writing. Danny got his surgery. I found the $8,000 in cash stuffed behind my truck's spare tire the next morning, along with something else, a small plastic bag containing what looked like fingernail clippings and a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. Payment for services rendered. The cultivation continues. The Whitmore mansion burned down 3 days later. Officials blamed faulty electrical work, never found any evidence of the basement or what it contained. But I drive past that property sometimes and the ground is still warm. Nothing grows there anymore. I don't take emergency calls anymore. I stick to scheduled appointments with people I know, and I never work on industrial appliances. To this day, I still wake up sometimes with the taste of that sweet, rotten smell in my mouth and my left hand writing words I don't remember forming. They're still hungry. They're still growing. They're waiting for you to come back. 6 months later, I moved my family out of Kentucky entirely. But I still get calls on my business line from that same thin, hollow voice, offering me triple rates for emergency jobs in basements I'll never visit again. The last call came just 2 weeks ago. The voice was different this time. Younger, more desperate. It said it was Danny, my son, calling from somewhere underground. Said he needed help. Said they were keeping him in a cold place. Said I was the only one who could fix what was wrong. But Danny was sitting right next to me when the call came in, watching TV and doing his homework. The surgery had worked perfectly. He hadn't had a seizure in over a year. I hung up the phone, but I can still hear that voice sometimes when the house gets very quiet. And my left hand has started writing different messages now. Come back, Dad. We're all waiting for you down here. We need you to fix the cold. I keep the torch next to my bed these days, just in case. Because I'm starting to think that whatever was under the Whitmore place, whatever made that deal with the old mining families, isn't finished with me yet. And I'm terrified that one day I'm going to wake up and find that the real Danny never made it home from that hospital. The thing wearing his face is just better at pretending to be human than Chen ever was. I'm 29 years old, and I used to run a mobile hair salon throughout eastern Kentucky. I say used to because what happened at the Riverside Mansion last October changed everything about how I see my work and myself. I'd been struggling to keep my business going for nearly 3 years, driving my beat-up Honda Civic from trailer park to farmhouse, doing $25 cuts in people's kitchens just to pay for gas to the next appointment. Most weeks I was lucky to clear $200, and that was before expenses. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September. A woman named Carolyn had gotten my number from Mrs. Henderson, a regular client in Hazard. She wanted me to do hair and makeup for her wedding party. 13 women total, including herself. $5,000 cash for 1 day's work. I almost laughed and hung up because it sounded like a scam, but something in her voice made me listen. She was very specific about the details. The wedding was at a restored 1920s mansion in Covington, and everything had to be done in the original bridal suite. For authenticity, she said, the photos have to capture the right atmosphere. Looking back now, I should have asked why she couldn't find a stylist closer to Covington. Should have wondered why someone would pay so much for a mobile stylist when Louisville salons were 30 minutes away. But I was 3 months behind on rent, living on dollar menu items and whatever my mom could slip me when she thought I wasn't looking. $5,000 would save my business and my apartment. I told Carolyn yes without asking any more questions. The drive to Covington took me through some of the most isolated parts of Kentucky I'd ever seen. Past abandoned coal towns and forests that seemed to swallow the road whole. My GPS kept losing signal, forcing me to navigate by hand-drawn directions Carolyn had texted me, the Riv. Riverside Mansion sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through dead oak trees, their branches forming a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the morning sun. The mansion itself was beautiful in that unsettling way old buildings can be. Perfectly restored, but somehow empty of life. All Art Deco lines and tall windows, painted in colors that looked expensive but felt cold. The parking lot was empty except for a white van I didn't recognize. Carolyn had told me to arrive at 8 a.m. sharp, that the wedding party would already be in the bridal suite getting ready. I found the bridal suite on the second floor, following brass plaques through hallways that smelled like lavender and something underneath it that reminded me of my grandmother's funeral home. The room was like stepping into a museum exhibit about the 1920s. Original wallpaper with hand-painted roses, antique furniture arranged with mathematical precision, everything positioned like it was waiting for a magazine photographer. But the dust bothered me immediately. It wasn't scattered randomly like dust should be. It formed deliberate patterns on the hardwood floor, spirals and geometric shapes that looked almost like writing in a language I didn't recognize. When I walked across the room, my footsteps disturbed the patterns, but within minutes they reformed exactly as they'd been before. The vanity mirror dominated the entire north wall. Massive silver frame with intricate carvings of roses and thorns, glass so clear it seemed to reflect more light than it should. When I looked into it, my reflection appeared normal at first glance, but something felt wrong. The angle was off by maybe half a degree, making my face look subtly asymmetrical. The 12 bridesmaids were already seated in matching chairs arranged in a perfect semicircle facing the mirror. They sat completely still, hands folded identically in their laps, all wearing the same expression of patient waiting. They didn't acknowledge me when I entered, didn't even seem to notice I was there. As I set up my equipment, I kept stealing glances at them. Something was wrong with their faces, but it took me several minutes to figure out what. They all looked identical, not similar like sisters or cousins. I mean perfectly, surgically identical. Same bone structure, same scars behind their left ears, same tiny mole on their right cheekbones. Even their hair grew in exactly the same patterns. Carolyn entered at exactly 8:30, and my breath caught in my throat. She was identical to the bridesmaids. 13 women, all with the same face, all staring at me with the same expectant smile. "Thank you for coming, Destiny," Carolyn said, her voice warm but somehow hollow. "We've been waiting for you for such a long time." I started with the first bridesmaid. a woman who introduced herself as Margaret. The moment I touched her hair, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. It felt too thick, almost plastic, but it was definitely growing from her scalp. When I ran my comb along her hairline, I could feel raised seams under the skin, like the hair was somehow grafted on but still living. Margaret didn't react when I pulled too hard while sectioning. Didn't flinch when the hot curling iron accidentally brushed her neck. No pain response at all. In the mirror, I watched her reflection move a fraction of a second after she did, like there was a delay between reality and what the glass showed me. As I worked on Margaret's hair, something strange started happening to my own reflection. My skin looked smoother, more even. The dark circles under my eyes from months of poor sleep were fading. My body seemed to be reshaping itself subtly. Waist narrower, posture straighter, face more symmetrical. It was like watching a real-time beauty filter being applied to my life. "Beautiful work," Margaret whispered, though her lips barely moved. The other bridesmaids echoed her words in perfect unison. Beauty requires sacrifice. I moved on to the second bridesmaid, then the third. With each woman I styled, my reflection improved more dramatically. But I started noticing other changes too. My hands were beginning to ache, joints stiffening like arthritis was setting in. My fingernails, usually strong from all the vitamins I took, started developing ridges and thin spots. By the time I reached the sixth bridesmaid, I realized the reflection in the mirror was showing me a different scene entirely. Instead of the modern bridal suite, I saw the same room decorated for a 1920s wedding. Jazz music played faintly in the background, though there was no radio or speaker in the actual room. The women in the reflection wore period-appropriate dresses and had their hair styled in finger waves and pin curls. "You're starting to understand," Carolyn said, appearing behind me in the mirror even though she was still sitting across the room. "This mirror has been collecting beauty for nearly a century. It takes from some and gives to others. The transaction must always balance." I thought about my recent clients, how they'd been looking progressively worse even after I'd styled their hair. Mrs. Patterson, who used to be so proud of her silver waves, had called me crying last week because her hair was falling out in chunks. Sarah Mills, barely 25, had developed deep lines around her eyes overnight after I'd given her highlights. I'd assumed it was stress or maybe bad products, but now, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Honey, something's wrong with my face. Can you come over? I look 20 years older than I did yesterday." The truth hit me like ice water. I hadn't been getting better at my job over the past few months. I'd been stealing beauty from every client I touched, trading their faces for my success. The mirror hadn't just started working when I arrived here. It had been working through me for months, maybe longer. "The previous stylists are downstairs," Carolyn said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "What's left of them anyway? Just hands and eyes. Now, but they're still conscious. They exist to serve beauty. It's really quite an honor when you think about it." She showed me a leather guest book, its pages yellow with age. My name was written in faded ink on multiple pages. Destiny Palmer, 1923. Destiny Palmer, 1947. Destiny Palmer, 1978. Destiny Palmer, 2003. And now in fresh black ink, Destiny Palmer, 2024. "We've been having the same wedding for 100 years, Carolyn explained. "The same day, the same ceremony, over and over. But we need a new stylist each time. The previous one always wears out by the end." The changes in my body were accelerating. My hands were aging rapidly while my face grew younger, creating a grotesque imbalance. My fingers were developing severe arthritis, nails falling off entirely. But somehow I was still creating perfect hairstyles. The bridesmaids' faces were becoming supernaturally beautiful, but their bodies were starting to decay. The smell of formaldehyde mixed with expensive perfume became overwhelming. In the mirror, I could finally see their true forms. Corpses in wedding dresses, skin gray and mottled, eye sockets empty but somehow still watching me. They were animated by nothing but pure vanity, their beauty stolen from decades of victims. I understood now why the dust formed those patterns on the floor. It wasn't dust. It was the cremated remains of previous stylists, arranged in sigils that bound them to this room, to this eternal wedding that never ended. The mirror showed me more than just reflections. I could see the network of beauty it had created, stretching across Kentucky like a web. Every client I'd touched was connected to it now, their life force slowly draining to feed this place. My mother, Mrs. Henderson, dozens of women whose only crime was trusting me with their hair. But I also saw something else in the mirror's depth, the source of its power. A crack in the silver backing, shaped like a lightning bolt, where something had been damaged during the original installation. That's where the supernatural energy was entering our world. I needed to break that specific spot, not just damage the glass. I pulled out my travel-size hairspray and lighter, tools I always carried for touch-ups and the occasional cigarette break. But instead of just making a flame, I unscrewed the nozzle completely and dumped the entire contents of the aerosol can onto the mirror's surface, focusing on that crack in the backing. When I lit it, the explosion was immediate and devastating. The chemical fire burned at over 3,000 degrees, hot enough to shatter not just the glass, but the silver backing behind it. The bridesmaids shrieked as their faces began melting away, revealing the different women underneath. Decades of stylists who had been trapped in the same role, forced to replace the one before them. The mirror cracked in a spiderweb pattern from the point where I'd hit the damaged backing. I could see stolen beauty pouring out like liquid starlight, decades of it flowing back toward its original owners, but much of it simply dissipated, lost forever to time and death. As the mirror shattered completely, the entire room began to shift. The 1920s overlay faded, revealing the bridal suite for what it really was, a moldering ruin that hadn't been maintained in decades. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture rotting, the floorboards warped with moisture damage. The bridesmaids collapsed into piles of clothing and dust, each pile marked with a small brass nameplate showing different years: 1923, 1947, 1965, 1978, 1991, 2003, 2018. I was supposed to be 2024. I ran through hallways that were now crumbling and water-damaged, past rooms filled with moldering furniture and broken windows. The mansion wasn't restored at all. It was a ruin, abandoned for decades. Whatever force had been maintaining the illusion was gone now. My car started immediately, and I drove back toward civilization with my hands shaking, so badly I could barely steer. Every few miles, I checked my rearview mirror, expecting to see the mansion still burning behind me, but there was nothing there except empty road. That was 11 months ago. The changes to my appearance never stabilized. Some days I look 20, some days 60, sometimes older. Every mirror shows me at a different age, and photographs of me come out blurred or distorted. I still do hair, but I work exclusively by touch now. I've removed every mirror from my workspace in my apartment. My clients love the results, though they sometimes seem confused about who exactly styled their hair. They describe me differently to their friends, sometimes as a young woman just starting out, sometimes as an experienced stylist with decades of practice. I think the mirror's influence is still with me somehow, but weaker now, contained. The women I had unknowingly stolen beauty from gradually recovered, though some damage was permanent. My mother's face returned to normal within a few weeks, but Mrs. Patterson never got her hair back, and Sarah Mills still has those lines around her eyes. I researched the Riverside mansion after everything happened. It burned down in 1924, killing 13 members of a wedding party. The bride, Carolyn Riverside, had been obsessed with beauty and youth, spending her family's coal fortune on experimental cosmetic procedures and rumored occult practices. The fire was ruled an accident, but witnesses reported seeing the bridal suite continue burning for days after the rest of the mansion was just ashes. The land was sold and resold multiple times over the decades, but every attempt to rebuild failed. Construction workers reported tools going missing, machinery breaking down, and strange accidents that always seemed to happen in what would have been the bridal suite location. I still get calls sometimes from women who say they found my number written in old appointment books or business cards that appeared in their purses. I always decline. I know now that some jobs, no matter how much money they offer, aren't worth taking. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I can still hear Carolyn's voice carried on the wind, asking if I'm available for a wedding consultation. I never answer, but I know she's still out there somewhere, still looking for her next stylist. The worst part is that I understand now why she chose me. It wasn't just my financial desperation that made me vulnerable. It was my vanity, my secret belief that I deserved to be more beautiful, more successful, more than what I was. The mirror didn't corrupt me. It just revealed what was already there, waiting. I'm 34 years old and I work as a home health aide here in Kentucky. Been doing it for about 8 years now, mostly with elderly patients, but sometimes I get assigned to younger folks who need round-the-clock care. The pay's decent enough, and honestly, I like helping people who can't help themselves. Makes me feel like I'm doing something that matters, you know? Last fall, I got assigned to this case in Laurel County, a 16-year-old boy named Jason, who'd been paralyzed in a car accident about 2 years prior. The family had bought this old Victorian house specifically because it was isolated, about 3 miles off the main road and surrounded by thick woods. They'd spent a fortune converting it into basically a mini hospital for their son. The house had been empty for nearly 30 years before Jason's family bought it. Built in 1887, it had belonged to the Whitmore family until the last owner, Dr. Samuel Whitmore, died in the house back in 1994. According to county records I looked up later, Dr. Whitmore had been some kind of experimental physician who'd run a private practice out of the home's converted basement. The locals I talked to said he'd treated patients with unusual conditions, folks the regular hospitals wouldn't take. What struck me first about the house wasn't the medical equipment, but how wrong everything felt. The hallways were too long, like the proportions had been stretched. Doors opened into rooms that seemed bigger on the inside than they should have been. And the temperature, even with the heating system running constantly, there were spots throughout the house that stayed cold enough to see your breath. Jason's parents had installed bars on every window, not just for security, but because Jason claimed things tried to get in at night. Each door had 3 separate locks, and they'd hung mirrors in every hallway corner. When I asked about the mirrors, his mother just said they helped Jason feel less watched. The medical setup was impressive, but excessive. Way more equipment than any home case I'd worked. Multiple heart monitors, backup ventilators, even some antique medical devices that looked like they belonged in a museum. Jason's father explained they'd found most of the old equipment in the basement when they moved in, and their doctor had suggested keeping it as historical supplements to Jason's care. That first night started normal enough. Jason's parents left around 6, and I settled in for what I figured would be a typical overnight shift. Jason seemed comfortable, watching Netflix on his tablet while I organized my supplies. The house was quiet except for the constant hum of medical equipment and the old Victorians' settling sounds. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed Jason watching something move across the ceiling. When I looked up, I saw the shadows were wrong. They fell in directions that didn't match the light sources. Jason's eyes tracked the shadows as they shifted and flowed like liquid. Finally, he blinked at his computer and slowly typed, "House woke up. It knows you're here." The scratching in the walls started around 10, but it wasn't random animal sounds. It followed a pattern. 3 scratches, pause, 3 scratches, pause. I realized it was Morse code when Jason typed, "SOS, someone trapped in walls." I followed the scratching sounds to the basement door. It was locked, but I could hear what sounded like medical equipment running down there. The same electronic beeps and hums from Jason's room, but older, more rhythmic. When I asked Jason about it, he typed, "Dr. Whitmore still practicing. House won't let him stop." The really strange thing happened around 11. Jason's vitals started showing impossible readings. Heart rate of 200, then 40, then flatlining, then normal. But I could see his chest rising and falling steadily. When I manually checked his pulse, it was steady at 70. That's when I noticed the antique medical equipment had turned on by itself and was running some kind of diagnostic program. I found the first hair while adjusting Jason's pillow, a single white hair, almost 3 feet long and thick as wire. It had been braided with what looked like surgical thread. When I held it up to the light, I could see it pulsed like it had a heartbeat. Jason typed, "House collects from everyone who stays, adds them to the basement." As I was throwing the hair away, I noticed deep claw marks gouged into Jason's wooden headboard. Fresh scratches, but Jason's hands haven't moved since his accident. When I touched the marks, they were warm and slightly damp. Jason typed, "Not my hands. House remembering other patients." Around midnight, the mirrors started showing things that weren't there. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Figures in old-fashioned medical gowns pushing wheelchairs through hallways where no one walked. The reflections were always one step behind reality, like the house was replaying scenes from the past. Jason started typing again. Dr. Whitmore died during surgery. House trapped his spirit. Now he experiments on everyone who stays overnight. He paused, then continued. At 3:33 a.m., House becomes his operating room again. Basement patients wake up. They need new caregiver. I asked him what he meant, but he just kept typing. I'm not paralyzed from accident. House paralyzed me. Need still patients for experiments. Parents don't know. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in seconds. I could see my breath, and frost started forming on the medical equipment screens. Jason typed frantically. He's coming upstairs. Hide. I grabbed a blanket and hid behind the antique medical cabinet in the corner. At exactly 3:33 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway, the measured pace of someone making medical rounds. The basement door creaked open, and I heard more footsteps, lots of them, shuffling up the stairs. Dr. Whitmore entered Jason's room first. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a blood-stained surgical gown from the 1800s. His face was gray-white, like he'd been dead for decades, and his hands were too long, with surgical instruments fused to his fingers. Behind him shuffled a line of patients, some in wheelchairs, others on gurneys, all in various states of medical experimentation. I watched through the cabinet's glass door as Dr. Whitmore began examining Jason with his instrument fingers. The other patients arranged themselves around the room like they were observing a teaching surgery. Some had been opened up and never closed, their organs visible and pulsing. Others had been stitched together with different body parts, extra arms, mismatched legs, heads attached at wrong angles. Excellent preservation, Dr. Whitmore said in a voice like grinding bone. 2 years of treatment, and the specimen shows no deterioration. The house feeds him well. He turned to one of his patients, a woman whose head had been replaced with some kind of mechanical device. Nurse Patterson, prepare the new caregiver for processing. We need fresh neural tissue for next week's experiments. That's when I realized they could see me through the glass. Every dead eye in the room turned toward my hiding spot. The house itself started moving then. The walls stretched and contracted like breathing. The floor tilted, sending medical equipment sliding toward the center of the room. The mirrors showed dozens of Dr. Whitmores from different time periods, all performing surgery simultaneously. I burst from the cabinet and ran for the door, but the hallway had changed. It stretched on forever, with doors opening into operating rooms where long-dead patients writhed on tables. I could hear Dr. Whitmore behind me, his instrument fingers clicking against the walls of house as he pursued. You cannot leave during treatment hours. His voice echoed from everywhere at once. The house requires fresh specimens for the good doctor's work. I made it to the front door, but the locks had multiplied. Not 3 anymore, but dozens, all different types and eras. Some needed skeleton keys, others combination locks, some just keyholes with no visible mechanism. My hands shook as I tried to work through them while the footsteps got closer. Behind me, I could hear Jason screaming. Not typing, but actually screaming as Dr. Whitmore began whatever procedure he'd planned. The sound of antique medical equipment filled the house, mixing with modern machines in a symphony of surgical horror. The last lock opened just as Dr. Whitmore's instrument fingers grabbed my shoulder. His touch burned like ice, and I felt my legs starting to go numb, the same paralysis that had trapped Jason. The house chooses its residents carefully, he whispered in my ear. You'll make an excellent addition to our permanent staff. I threw myself through the door and ran into the night. Behind me, the house lit up like a hospital, every window showing silhouettes of medical procedures. I could see Jason's room clearly. Dr. Whitmore was connecting him to the antique equipment while his patient assistants prepared surgical tools. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake. As I ran down that long driveway, I looked back and saw myself in Jason's window. Not Dr. Whitmore operating on Jason, but me, Diana, standing over his bed with surgical instruments in my hands. The house was showing me my future. I called in sick the next morning and quit by phone. Told the agency I had a family emergency and couldn't continue. They were annoyed. Apparently, they'd been through 7 caregivers with this case in 2 years. Everyone quit after one night, and no one would explain why. I drove back to the house 3 weeks later, during daylight hours, with 2 friends as backup. I had to know if Jason was okay, had to see if I could help him somehow. But when we got there, the house looked completely different. The Victorian was clean and well-maintained, painted bright white with flower boxes in the windows. A for sale sign sat in the yard with a sold sticker across it. No medical equipment visible through the windows, no bars, no excessive locks. I knocked on the door, and a normal-looking family answered. Parents with 2 young kids, no disabled teenager anywhere. They said they just bought the house from a bank auction. The previous owners had abandoned it suddenly, leaving everything behind except for some medical equipment in the basement. Strangest thing, the father told me. The basement's full of antique surgical equipment, some of it over 100 years old. We're donating it all to the Medical History Museum in Lexington. I asked about Jason and his family, but these people had never heard of them. According to the neighbors I talked to, the house had been empty for months before this family moved in. That night, I called the agency and asked about the case. They had no record of a Jason Whitmore in Laurel County. No record of me being assigned to any case at that address. When I insisted I'd worked there, they checked their files twice and told me I must be confused. I'd never taken any assignments in Laurel County. I still have the white hair I pulled from Jason's pillow, braided with surgical thread. It's the only proof I have that any of it happened. Sometimes late at night, I swear I can feel it pulsing like a heartbeat. I don't work overnight shifts anymore. Can't bring myself to be alone in houses after dark. Because I know now that some houses don't just contain ghosts. They contain entire worlds, entire realities that exist parallel to ours. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to be there at the right time, you can slip between them. If you work in healthcare and get assigned to an isolated house with excessive medical equipment, ask questions, find out who lived there before, check how many caregivers have quit, and if anyone mentions Dr. Whitmore or surgical equipment in the basement, just walk away. Because some houses never stop being hospitals. They just get better at hiding what kind of medicine they practice. I still drive past that address sometimes, and the house looks different every time. Sometimes Victorian, sometimes modern ranch, sometimes just an empty lot. But if I look carefully at 3:33 a.m., I can always see the medical equipment glowing in the windows, and the silhouettes of Dr. Whitmore and his patients making their eternal rounds. And sometimes in one of those windows, I see myself standing over a patient with surgical instruments in my hands, finally taking my place as part of the house's permanent medical staff. That's when I drive away as fast as I can, because I know the house is still calling me back to finish what we started. I'm 22 now, but I was 19 when this happened, working nights at Domino's in Hazard, Kentucky to save money for college. My family had lived in these mountains for 4 generations, so I knew every holler and back road in Perry County like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. The night everything changed started normal enough. It was a Thursday in October, cold enough that you could see your breath, and we were getting ready to close when the computer chimed with one last order. 13 pizzas to 847 Copperhead Road, way up in the hills past where most people lived. The address looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. What made it weird was the toppings. Half of them weren't on our menu. Things like Childhood Summers and Mother's Voice listed right there in the system, like they were pepperoni or mushrooms. Steve, my manager, stared at that order for a long time. He was in his 50s, had been running this store since I was in elementary school, and I'd never seen him look uncertain about anything. "Take the mountain road," he finally said, handing me the bags. "And Tyler, use the back door. Don't even try the front." I should have asked what he meant, but the tip was $200 cash, and I needed that money. The drive up Copperhead Road started normal enough. Narrow mountain curves I'd driven 1,000 times, familiar landmarks in my headlights. But about 20 minutes up, things started feeling wrong in ways I couldn't put my finger on. My radio began picking up stations that shouldn't exist, bluegrass music mixed with voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The GPS on my phone kept glitching, showing me driving through forests that weren't there, roads that curved the wrong direction. When I finally found 847, it looked like any other old mountain house. 2-story white farmhouse with a tin roof, probably built in the 1940s. But the silence, she was absolute. No dogs barking, no insects, no wind through the trees. Even my car engine seemed muffled, like the sound was being absorbed by something I couldn't see. The front door looked wrong somehow. It took me a few seconds to realize why. It was too perfect. The wood grain was painted on. The brass doorknob was flat as a photograph. When I reached out to knock, my knuckles hit solid wall. There was no door at all, just an incredibly realistic painting of one. I walked around back, remembering Steve's warning. The rear door was real enough. Old wooden screen door with actual depth and substance. I knocked and waited, holding 13 boxes that smelled like things I couldn't identify. Not exactly food smells, but something warmer, more personal, like walking into your grandmother's house on Christmas morning. An old woman answered, probably in her 70s, wearing a flour-dusted apron and the kind of wire-rimmed glasses my great-aunt used to wear. She looked completely normal except for her smile, which was too wide and showed too many teeth. "Come on in, honey," she said in the kind of mountain accent I'd grown up hearing. "Been waiting for you." The kitchen she led me into was bigger than the entire house should have been. Wood-burning stove, hand pump well, mason jars lining the shelves, everything that belonged in an old mountain kitchen. But covering every surface were pizza boxes from different decades. Some had logos I recognized, others were from places I'd never heard of. All of them looked fresh, like they'd just been delivered, but the dates written on them in faded pencil went back to the 1960s. "Just set yours right there with the others," she said, pointing to a space on the massive wooden table. "Help yourself to a slice if you want. Pizza's always better when it's warm." I set down my 13 boxes and opened one of the older ones out of curiosity. Inside was a perfect pizza, cheese still bubbling, crust golden brown. But the receipt taped to the top was dated September 15th, 1982. The delivery driver's name was written in, careful cursive, Steve Morrison. Steve, my manager Steve. But this was from when he would have been barely older than I was now. "Good boy, that's Steve," the woman said, watching me read. "Been delivering to us for 40 years now. Such a dedicated worker." I looked up from the receipt, confused. "But Steve's my manager. He's been—" "Oh, he still delivers here every few months," she interrupted, moving closer. "Brings us fresh drivers when the old ones get too tired. You're the third one this year." That's when I noticed the other people in the kitchen. They'd been so quiet I hadn't seen them before, but now they were impossible to miss. Men and women of different ages, all wearing delivery uniforms from different eras, all standing perfectly still like they were waiting for instructions. A teenage girl in a 1980s Pizza Hut visor, a middle-aged man wearing a Domino's shirt I recognized from old commercials, a kid who couldn't have been older than 16, wearing a uniform from a pizza place I'd never heard of. None of them were breathing. "They get tired after a while," the woman explained, following my stare. "All that driving up and down these mountain roads year after year. So we let them rest here. They don't need to worry about gas money or car repairs or getting home safe. They just stay here with us, where it's warm and there's always food." The teenage girl in the Pizza Hut visor turned her head to look at me, and her neck made a soft, grinding sound like old hinges. Her eyes were clouded over, but she smiled anyway. "Hi," she said in a voice like autumn leaves. "I'm Jennifer. I've been delivering here since 1987. More of them started turning toward me, moving with the same slow, creaking motions. They were all smiling, but their faces looked wrong. Skin too pale, eyes too dark, like they'd been underground for decades. "We take good care of our delivery do. Rivers," the old woman said. "Better than those pizza places ever did. No more deadlines, no more dangerous roads, no more rude customers. Just family dinners and warm beds and all the time in the world." I backed toward the door, but it wasn't there anymore. The wall was solid wood, like the door had never existed. The kitchen was getting bigger too, stretching out in directions that made my head hurt to think about. More delivery drivers kept emerging from rooms that hadn't been there seconds before, all of them wearing uniforms from different decades, all of them smiling those same wrong smiles. "Steve sends us the good ones," the woman continued. "The hard workers, the ones who really care about getting people their food hot and fresh. You're going to fit right in." That's when I understood. Steve wasn't just my manager, he was feeding them. Every few months, he'd find some excuse to send a driver up here, probably telling himself it was just business, just following orders from corporate or something. But he knew. He'd been here himself in 1982, and somehow he'd gotten out, but the house had never let him truly leave. The delivery drivers were moving closer now, shuffling with movements that were almost human but not quite. Their eyes were empty, but their mouths were moving, whispering the same things over and over. "Pizza delivery. 30 minutes or less. Hot and fresh. Pizza delivery. 30 minutes or less." My phone was dead. Not just the battery, the screen was completely black, like it was absorbing light instead of reflecting it. The car keys in my pocket felt ice cold, and when I pulled them out, they were covered in frost, despite the warm kitchen. "Don't fight it, honey," the woman said, reaching for me with fingers that were too long and bent in too many places. "Fighting just makes it harder. Jennifer here fought for 3 days before she accepted her new job. But look how happy she is now." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically, her head bobbing like a broken doll's. "I love working here," she said. "Best job I ever had." But then I remembered something my grandfather had told me when I was little, back when he used to tell stories about the old days in the mountains. "Some houses get hungry," he'd said. "Not for food, but for life, for the warmth people carry. And the only way to beat them is to give them something they want more than what they're trying to take." I looked at all those pizza boxes, decades worth of deliveries, and I understood what the house really wanted. It wasn't the drivers themselves, it was what they represented. The act of delivery, the completion of service, the satisfaction of a job well done. I grabbed one of my own pizza boxes and opened it. Inside was a pizza that looked normal enough, but when I picked up a slice, it felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It pulsed gently, like it had a heartbeat. "What are you doing?" the woman asked, and for the first time her voice didn't sound sweet. It sounded worried. "Completing the delivery," I said, and took a bite. It tasted like every pizza I'd ever delivered rolled into one. The satisfaction of seeing a customer's face light up, the pride of getting there within 30 minutes, the simple joy of doing a job well. It tasted like purpose. The delivery drivers stopped moving. The woman stepped back. The kitchen walls flickered, and for just a moment I could see through them to what was really there. Not a farmhouse kitchen, but a cavern carved into the mountain itself, walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. "You can't," the woman said. But her voice was changing, becoming layered with echoes of all the drivers who'd been trapped here. "The delivery isn't complete until the customer is satisfied," I finished, taking another bite. "And you've been satisfied for 40 years. Time to close the account." With each bite, I could feel the house losing its grip on me. The trapped dew. Rivers began to change too, color returning to their skin, life coming back to their eyes. Jennifer blinked and looked around like she was seeing the kitchen for the first time in decades. Where am I?" she asked, her voice clear and human again. "Time to go home," I told her, and she nodded like that made perfect sense. The old woman was changing too, her kindly appearance melting away to reveal something ancient and hungry, something that had been feeding on lost travelers since before the first settlers came to these mountains. But she was fading now, becoming transparent, her hold on this place finally broken. "The delivery is complete," I said, finishing the last bite of pizza. Customer satisfied, service ended. And suddenly I was standing in the ruins of an old foundation, holding empty pizza bags, with my car parked on a road that barely existed. My phone showed full bars and the correct time, 11:30 p.m. According to the GPS, I was on an unnamed logging road 5 miles from where Copperhead Road was supposed to be. I drove back to town, and when I got to the store, Steve was waiting for me. He looked older somehow, more tired than I'd ever seen him. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Delivery complete," I said. "Customer satisfied." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good," he said. That's good." I quit the next morning. Told Steve I was starting college early, which wasn't exactly a lie. I enrolled that same week, got student loans, did whatever I had to do to never deliver another pizza. Steve didn't argue, just shook my hand and said he understood. 3 months later, I heard that Steve had sold the franchise and moved to Florida. The new manager told me that when they cleaned out his office, they found a locked filing cabinet full of old delivery receipts going back 40 years, all for the same address that didn't exist on any map. I'm 22 now, studying computer science at UK, and I've got a good life ahead of me. But I still think about that night sometimes, about Jennifer and all those other drivers who'd been trapped for decades. I like to think they all made it home eventually, that breaking the house's hold on them gave them the chance to finish whatever journeys they'd started all those years ago. The old foundation on that unnamed logging road is gone now. Google Earth shows nothing but forest where it used to be. But sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains late at night, I'll catch a whiff of pizza and remember the taste of a job well done. And I remember my grandfather's other piece of advice about hungry houses. Once you feed them what they really want, they don't need to be hungry anymore. I think he was right. I'm 45 years old, and I work maintenance for Bluegrass Property Management here in eastern Kentucky. Been cleaning buildings around Pikeville and the surrounding hollers for about 15 years now, ever since my wife Sarah got diagnosed with MS and we needed the extra income for her treatments. The work's honest, and I don't mind the solitude. Gives me time to think while I'm mopping floors and emptying trash. Last spring, I got assigned to clean the old Brennan house up on Grapevine Road. If you're from around here, you know the place. That big Victorian mansion the coal company built back in 1892 for their operations manager. 3 stories of Kentucky limestone and walnut, with those tall windows that look out over the valley. Beautiful house, really, even if it has a reputation. The Brennan family lived there for almost 60 years before the mine played out. After that, it sat empty until the 1980s, when a tech startup from Lexington bought it cheap and converted it into their headquarters. They put in cubicles and conference rooms, ran Ethernet cables through those old walls, turned the ballroom into a server room. It worked for about 3 years until the night shift employees started reporting problems. The company pulled out in March, real sudden-like. Just packed up their computers one night and never came back. But they're still paying to have the place maintained while they figure out what to do with it. That's where I come in, twice a week, Tuesday and Friday nights, keep the place from falling apart. First thing I noticed was the parking lot. Someone had built these little stone cairns all around the entrance, maybe 6 or 7 of them. Each one had an employee ID badge balanced on top, all from that tech company. I figured it was some kind of memorial the workers left behind when they evacuated, so I let them be. Seemed respectful. But the house itself felt wrong from the minute I walked in. There was this smell throughout the whole first floor, like wet earth mixed with old copper pipes and something sweet I couldn't place. I've cleaned a lot of buildings over the years, and you get used to all kinds of odors. This one made my teeth ache. The company had left behind most of their furniture, and everything was covered in this fine layer of dust that didn't look right. Too uniform, like it had been sifted over everything through a screen. And it tasted metallic when I breathed it in, made my tongue go numb. The second floor was where they'd put the executive offices, and that's where things got strange. The ceiling tiles were all scratched up, deep gouges like something with claws had been up there. But these weren't small marks. They were 11, maybe 12 feet up, and the scratches were too wide apart to be from any animal I knew. The conference room table looked like it had been attacked with a rake, except the gouges were filled with this amber-colored sap that never dried. Touched it once and my finger stuck for a good 10 seconds. In the break room, the freezer was packed solid with rotting meat. Deer mostly, but some I couldn't identify. The weird part was, the electricity had been shut off for months. That meat should have been liquid by then, but it was still frozen solid, still giving off cold air. I could see my breath when I opened the door. Started finding tufts of white fur caught in the air vents throughout the building. Coarse stuff, thicker than dog hair, more like elk or deer. But it was too long, too wiry, and it had this oily feel that made my skin crawl. I'd pull it out and throw it away, but there'd be more the next time I came in. By my fourth visit, I was noticing patterns that didn't make sense. Every Tuesday night at exactly 2:47 a.m., the old elevator would start running. I'd be downstairs mopping the lobby, and I'd hear that distinctive ding, hear the cables groaning. Sometimes it went up to the third floor, sometimes down to the basement. Never the same. Destination twice. I checked with the property manager about automatic systems, but he said everything had been disconnected when the company left. There was breathing in the walls, deep, labored sounds like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to catch their breath. I'd follow it from room to room, putting my ear against the old plaster, but it moved too fast. Like whatever was making it could squeeze through spaces that weren't there, travel along paths that only existed inside the walls themselves. The tall windows started fogging up from the inside, even on warm nights. When I'd wipe them clean, I'd find handprints pressed against the glass from inside the building. But these only had 3 fingers, and the palms were too long, stretched out like taffy. That got to me more than I care to admit. I started carrying extra paper towels just to clean them off as soon as I spotted them. The old vending machines the company had left behind would kick on randomly, humming to life even though they'd been unplugged. They'd drop things, but not snacks. Acorns, small bones, beetles, chunks of tree bark. I unplugged every machine I could find, even duct taped the cords to make sure, but they kept running anyway. Later found out the power company had disconnected the building's main line 2 weeks before the company evacuated. One night I was up on the 3rd floor when every computer monitor they'd left behind flickered on at once. They were showing security camera footage, but it was all of me. Me vacuuming the lobby, me cleaning windows, me walking through hallways I'd been in hours earlier. Thing is, I'd looked for cameras my first day and never found any, and some of these angles were impossible. Shots from inside cabinets, from underneath desks, from up in the corners where the old crown molding met the ceiling. I started finding teeth embedded in the plaster walls of the 2nd floor. Human teeth hammered in so deep I couldn't pry them out. They were arranged in perfect circles, like someone had used them to mark territory. The executive offices all had strips of red fabric tied to the door handles. They smelled like iron, like old blood, and when I tried to cut one off, the fabric was tough as leather and left my hands stained. Every mirror in the building was cracked in the same pattern, spreading lines that looked exactly like deer antlers. In what used to be the CEO's office, I found a pile of small bones under the mahogany desk, sorted by size from tiny bird bones up to what looked like finger bones. And throughout the building, I kept finding these sticky handprints on every surface. But the thumbs were on the wrong side, like whatever made them had backwards hands. The night I saw it clearly was a Tuesday in June, just after midnight. I was cleaning the 3rd floor when I heard something moving around in the old boardroom. Grabbed my flashlight and eased the door open, expecting to find a raccoon or possum that had gotten inside. It was crouched over the conference table right where I'd been finding those claw marks every week, 9 feet tall at least, wearing the tattered remains of a business suit. The fabric was expensive, I could tell, even torn up like it was. Its skin was this pale gray color, stretched tight over bones that bent in directions bones shouldn't bend. The spine curved like it was broken, but it moved smoothly on all fours, despite the suit jacket still hanging off its shoulders. The head was the worst part, elongated like a deer skull, but with human eyes. And I recognized those eyes, even in that nightmare face. That was Jim Williams, the CFO whose picture I'd seen in the company directory they'd left behind. Those same pale blue eyes, that same worried expression he'd worn in his corporate head show. T. It was making this clicking sound deep in its throat, like sonar. And I swear on my mother's grave it was tracking my heartbeat. Every time my pulse jumped, those clicks got faster, more insistent. I backed out of that room real slow, trying to keep my breathing steady. But it caught my scent, or maybe it heard something I didn't know I was making. That deer skull head snapped around, and those human eyes locked onto mine. When it smiled, I could see it had too many teeth, arranged in rows like a shark. I ran. Didn't even try to be quiet about it. Hit the main staircase and took the steps 3 at a time, but I could hear it following. Not running, loping. Like a wolf, but heavier, the old wooden floors creaking under its weight. I made it to my truck and locked the doors, hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped my keys. That's when I found the journal on my passenger seat. Don't ask me how it got there, because I sure as hell didn't put it there. It was bound in expensive leather with James P. Williams, Chief Financial Officer, embossed on the cover in gold letters. The entries went right up until the night the company evacuated. Williams wrote about how the business was failing, how they were hemorrhaging money and facing bankruptcy. He described midnight meetings in the woods behind the house, meetings with something that had been living in these Kentucky hills since before the first Cherokee settlements. The Brennan House, according to Williams' research, had been built on an old Cherokee burial ground. But not just any burial ground. This was where they'd buried the cursed dead, the ones who'd made deals with dark spirits and couldn't find peace. The coal company had known about it when they built the house, but they figured their Christian prayers would be enough to keep whatever was down there quiet. They were wrong. The Williams family had reported strange occurrences from the day they moved in. Voices in the walls, doors opening by themselves, family portraits that changed overnight. But they'd adapted, made their peace with whatever share of the house. The coal money was too good to walk away from, and the presence seemed content to coexist as long as it was acknowledged, respected. When the tech company moved in, they brought different energy, young, aggressive, hungry for success at any cost. And when their startup began failing, when investor money dried up and clients jumped ship, the executives got desperate. Williams had found references in the old coal company records about arrangements the Brennan family had made, offerings left in the basement, agreements honored under the light of the full moon. When conventional business strategies failed, Williams convinced the other executives to try the old ways. The deal was simple: monthly tributes in exchange for prosperity. They started small, livestock, then pets. But the presence wanted more. It wanted humans. Employees who wouldn't be missed, who didn't have family asking questions. They'd been feeding it night shift workers for 8 months, telling them to investigate strange sounds in the basement, sending them down alone. But Williams got scared when the presence started changing them, started making them like itself. The transformation was slow at first, just enhanced senses, increased strength. But then their bones began to soften and reshape, their faces elongated, their humanity slipped away piece by piece. The night they evacuated, Williams had tried to break the contract. He'd brought a priest to bless the building, scattered salt in the basement, burned sage in every room. That's when it came for all of them at once. The entire executive team transformed into something between human and the ancient thing that had claimed this land centuries ago. They couldn't leave the property. The curse bound them to the house and the land around it. But they weren't quite dead, weren't quite alive. They were territorial now, marking their space, hunting in the surrounding woods, bringing their prey back to consume in the basement where their master waited. I kept going back because I needed the money, and because I realized they weren't trying to hurt me. I was maintenance. I belonged to the building, same as them. They'd circle my cleaning cart sometimes, sniffing my supplies, learning my scent. They'd mark different floors with mixtures of saliva and blood, claiming territory like animals. But they never touched me. I'd find deer carcasses arranged in the boardroom like they were attending meetings. Sometimes I'd see them sitting at their old desks, typing on computers that didn't work, going through the motions of jobs they could barely remember. Williams would stand by the windows, looking out over the valley where they used to hunt, clicking his throat in patterns that almost sounded like speech. The house started changing around them. Plants pushed up through the expensive hardwood floors. Trees sprouted in the corners of cubicles. A creek began running through the basement, cold mountain water that had never been there before. The temperature dropped every week, ice forming in July, snow falling inside even when it was 90 degrees outside. They were making it wild again, turning it back into what these Kentucky mountains had been before humans arrived. The old Cherokee spirits were reclaiming the land, and the transformed executives were their willing servants. One night in August, I found Williams in the lobby, standing perfectly still in his ruined suit. He turned those pale eyes on me, and for just a moment I saw something human flicker behind them. His throat clicked rapidly, desperately, and I realized he was trying to speak. "Help," he managed, the word coming out like grinding glass. "Can't. Stop. Hungry." But then the moment passed, and he was animal again, loping up the stairs on all fours to rejoin his pack. I tried to help them, brought a priest from St. Paul's, but he took one look at the house and refused to go inside. Contacted the state archaeological office of Schools about the Cherokee burial ground, but they said the land had been blessed by the coal company and was legally considered consecrated Christian ground. The truth is, there was nothing I could do. These mountains are old, older than our laws or our religions. Things live in these hollers that were here before the Cherokee, before anyone. And when desperate people make deals with ancient powers, sometimes the price is everything they used to be. I still clean the Brennan house twice a week. The company keeps paying, and William still leaves my check on the front desk every Friday, signed in his careful corporate handwriting. They don't hunt me because I'm part of their territory now, part of the building they're bound to protect. Sometimes I find fresh deer meat by my truck, still warm, carefully butchered. It helps with the grocery bills, and Sarah never asks where it comes from. Sometimes late at night when I'm emptying trash or mopping floors, I'll hear them moving through the walls, clicking to each other in their broken language, planning hunts or dividing territory, or just trying to remember what it felt like to be human. The house is theirs now, has been theirs since the first Cherokee brave made a deal with the spirits in the burial ground below. The Brennan family knew it, lived with it, respected it. The coal company ignored it at their peril. The tech executives tried to use it and paid the ultimate price. Me? I just clean up after them. And in these Kentucky mountains, where the old ways still matter and the dead don't always stay buried, that's enough to keep me safe. Looking back now, I think that's all they ever wanted. Someone to acknowledge what they'd become, to treat them with the respect the mountain spirits demand. And honestly, after 15 years of cleaning up after corporate executives, working for creatures that used to be human isn't all that different from working for creatures that still are. The only difference is these ones leave better tips. I'm 38 years old and work as a cable installer for Spectrum. Been doing it for about 12 years now, mostly around central Kentucky. It's honest work, pays decent, and I like being out of an office most days. I've got a wife and 2 kids back home in Elizabethtown. Sarah's been on my case lately about working too much overtime, but with Dylan needing those speech therapy sessions and Emma starting middle school, every extra dollar counts. I was getting close to losing this job when what I'm about to tell you happened. My completion rate had been slipping because I kept finding excuses to leave jobs that felt off. My supervisor had already written me up twice, and one more strike meant unemployment. So when I got the work order for the old Blackwood house way out in Breckinridge County, I knew I couldn't afford to bail on another job, even though everything about this particular order felt wrong from the start. The address was listed as 1847 Sorrow Creek Road, a name that should have been my first warning. Customer name was just Blackwood Family, and when I pulled up the service history, there was a gap. No installations, no service calls, nothing for the past 15 years. Then I found an old work order from 2008 with a note from Jake Morrison, a tech I'd worked with before. Customer became agitated when asked about previous residence. Refused entry to basement. Job incomplete. Do not return. Jake had been with the company for 15 years. He wasn't the type to leave jobs unfinished. But Sarah had been working double shifts at the diner just to keep us afloat, and Dylan's therapist wanted to increase his sessions. I couldn't come back empty-handed again. Besides, how bad could one old house be? The drive out there took me deeper into Kentucky backwoods than I'd ever been. Roads got narrower and narrower until I was following what was basically a deer paw, through thick forest. No cell service, no other houses for miles, just trees so dense they blocked out most of the afternoon sun. I passed an old historical marker half hidden in weeds. Sorrow Creek Settlement, Est, 1847. Abandoned, 1862. Someone had spray-painted "Still Here" across the bottom in faded red letters. When I finally found 1847, I understood why the settlement had been abandoned. The house squatted at the end of a gravel drive like something diseased. 3 stories of weathered clapboard siding, painted white once but now the color of old bones. Victorian architecture, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, windows placed asymmetrically, a wraparound porch that seemed to sag under some invisible weight. The whole structure tilted slightly to the left, as if the ground beneath it was slowly giving way. But what really got my attention was that every window on the first floor was lit up, warm yellow light spilling out onto the overgrown yard, and I could see shapes moving inside. A family going about their evening routine. That should have been my second warning. The work order said the house had been without cable service for over a decade. I grabbed my tools and walked up the creaking porch steps. Through the front window I could see them clearly now. A mother, father, and 2 children sitting around a dinner table. The father was cutting meat, the mother was pouring what looked like wine, and the kids were chattering away. A perfectly normal family scene, except they were all wearing clothes from different time periods. The mother had on a high-necked dress that looked like something from the 1890s. The father wore a Union Army uniform, brass buttons tarnished with age. The little girl was dressed like it was the 1950s, complete with Mary Jane shoes and a pink dress with a bow. The boy looked modern enough, except his t-shirt had a logo thut, or a band that broke up in 1987. I knocked on the door, and the conversation inside stopped immediately. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, and the door opened to reveal the father. Up close, his Union Army uniform was authentic. Not a costume, but the real thing, complete with old stains that looked suspiciously like blood. "You must be the cable man," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that didn't quite match his uniform. "We've been waiting for you." I hadn't called ahead. There was no appointment time on the work order. "Mr. Blackwood?" I asked. "I'm Marcus from Spectrum. Got a call about restoring your cable service." "That's right," he smiled, stepping aside to let me in. "We haven't had proper television in... Oh, what would you say, Martha? 15 years now?" The woman appeared in the hallway behind him, her long dress rustling against the hardwood floors. "Closer to 20, I'd say, not since the last man came." She had the palest skin I'd ever seen, almost translucent, with dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in years. The kids peeked around the corner, watching me with the kind of intense curiosity children usually reserve for exotic animals. The girl couldn't have been more than 8, but her eyes seemed much older. The boy looked about 10, but when he smiled, I noticed his teeth were too sharp, filed to points. "Well, let me take a look at your current setup," I said, trying to keep things professional. The father nodded and led me into the living room, where I got my first real look at the inside of the house. The room was decorated like a museum exhibit, but one that couldn't decide which time period it was representing. A Victorian settee sat next to a 1950s television set. Civil War-era photographs hung on walls covered in floral wallpaper that had to be from the 1970s. A modern PlayStation sat on a table next to an Edison phonograph. And covering every available surface were family photographs. Hundreds of them, in frames ranging from ornate Victorian silver to cheap plastic drugstore special. But something was wrong with the pictures. In each one, the same 4 people posed in the exact same positions, father standing behind mother's chair, children seated on either side, but their faces changed from photo to photo. Different hair colors, different features, different ages. Sometimes the father was black, sometimes white, sometimes Asian. The mother went from blonde to brunette to redhead. The children morphed from toddlers to teenagers and back again. "Lovely family photos," I said, trying to make conversation. "Thank you," Martha replied. "We've lived here for such a long time. You accumulate so many memories." I found the main cable line coming into the house through the basement. It was old, probably original to whenever cable first came out to this area, but it should have been functional. The weird thing was, it was already connected to a cable box in the living room, an ancient Zenith model that had to be from the early 80s. "You said you haven't had service in 15 years, I said, "but this box is already hooked up." The father looked confused for a moment, his head tilting to one side. "Is it? Well, I suppose we just forgot about it. We've been watching the same programs for so long, they all start to blur together." I turned on the TV. Static filled the screen, but I could swear I heard voices in the white noise. Faint conversations, laughter, the sound of people living their lives. The family gathered around the television like it was showing the most fascinating program in the world. "This is our favorite show," the little girl said, pointing at the static. "It's about families, lots and lots of families." "What channel is it?" I asked. "All of them," she replied. That's when I started paying attention to the smaller details, the way their shadows fell in the wrong directions, even when they moved. How their reflections in the old me, mirrors were slightly delayed, like the glass was struggling to keep up. The mother's breathing. I realized I hadn't seen her chest rise or fall once since I'd arrived. And the temperature. Despite the warm lighting, the house was freezing. My breath was starting to fog, and I could feel the cold seeping through my work clothes. "Is your heating working?" I asked. "Oh, we don't feel the cold anymore," Martha said. "Not since we learned to appreciate the warmth of family." The father was watching me work with intense interest, studying the way I moved, the tools I used. "How long have you been doing this job, Marcus?" "About 12 years. "Married?" "Yeah, wife and 2 kids." "How wonderful. What are their names?" Something about the way he asked made my skin crawl. Too eager, too interested. "Sarah, Dylan, and Emma," I said before I could stop myself. "Beautiful names," he murmured, and I saw him glance at the mother. She nodded slightly. I was trying to trace the cable signal when I heard footsteps above me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the second floor. But all 4 family members were right here in the living room with me. "Who else lives here?" I asked. The family exchanged glances. "Just us," the father said. "It's always been just us." The footsteps stopped directly overhead, and dust drifted down from the ceiling. Then I heard a voice, faint but definitely human. A man's voice calling out, "Help! Please! Someone help us!" The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. "Excuse me," I said, standing up. "I think I heard someone upstairs." "Oh, that's just the house settling," Martha said quickly. "Old houses make so many noises. You learn to ignore them after a while." But I was already moving toward the stairs. The family followed behind me, their footsteps unnaturally synchronized. As I climbed to the second floor, the voices became clearer. Multiple people talking in hushed, desperate tones. The upstairs hallway was lined with doors, all of them closed. The voices were coming from behind the last due, or on the right. I reached for the handle, but the father's hand clamped down on my wrist. His grip was ice cold and much stronger than it should have been. "I really don't think you want to go in there," he said. His voice had changed, become deeper, older. When I looked into his eyes, they weren't the same color they'd been downstairs. They'd shifted from brown to pale blue, like ice over deep water. "Who's in there?" "No one important. Just previous visitors. They decided to stay." I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Over his shoulder, I could see Martha and the children watching us. Their faces had changed too. Features shifting subtly. Skin taking on that same translucent quality as the mother's. "Let me go," I said. "Why would you want to leave?" the little girl asked. "We're having such a nice time. You could stay for dinner. "We're having roast." "What kind of roast?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. "The kind that used to ask too many questions," the boy said, and grinned with those sharp teeth. That's when I understood. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a trap. The Blackwood family, whoever they'd been originally, were long dead. What was wearing their faces, living in their house, was something else entirely. Something that fed on visitors and kept their voices as entertainment. The voices behind the door grew louder, more desperate. I could make out individual words now. Run. Get out. Don't let them keep you. I broke free from the father's grip and bolted for the stairs. Behind me, I heard the family moving, but not like humans. They moved like insects, with too many joints, making clicking sounds as they pursued me. I hit the front door at a dead run and fumbled with the handle. It wouldn't turn. I could hear them coming down the stairs, their movements becoming less and less human with each step. "Marcus," Martha called, her voice now a chorus of different voices layered on top of each other. "You forgot to finish the installation. We need our cable working. We need to see more families." I put my shoulder to the door, and it finally gave way. I stumbled out onto the porch and ran for my truck, not looking back until I was behind the wheel with the engine running. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing in the doorway. The father was still wearing his Union Army uniform, but his face had melted away entirely, revealing something raw and wet underneath. The mother's elegant dress hung on a frame that was all wrong, too tall, too thin, with too many arms. The children had dropped their human pretense altogether and were crawling across the porch ceiling like spiders. I drove away as fast as I dared on those narrow mountain roads, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I realized something was wrong with my truck radio. It was picking up conversations, family dinners, bedtime stories, arguments between spouses. The intimate sounds of people living their lives, all in voices I recognized from behind that upstairs door. I never filed a completion report for that job. When my supervisor asked about it, I told him the address didn't exist, showed him how the GPS couldn't find it, how there was no record of a Sorrow Creek Road in any county database. He checked the work order system. No record of the job, no customer named Blackwood, no service call scheduled. But I kept the work order. I've still got it in my toolbox, yellowed and brittle now. The address is there, clear as day. 1847 Sorrow Creek Road. I got a promotion 6 months later. My completion rate had improved dramatically once I stopped taking jobs that felt wrong. Sarah was happy I was working less overtime. Dylan's speech improved enough that he didn't need therapy anymore. Emma made honor roll in 7th grade. Everything went back to normal, except for the dreams. I dream about that house every few weeks. In the dreams, I'm sitting at the air dinner table wearing an old cable technician's uniform from the 1980s. Martha is serving roast that smells like copper and electricity. The children are asking about my family, writing down Sarah's and Dylan's and Emma's names in a leather book. And behind us, in frames covering every wall, are new family photos. Same 4 poses, same positioning. But now the faces are mine, Sarah's, Dylan's, Emma's. Picture after picture of us, aging and changing and becoming something else entirely. I always wake up before dessert. But sometimes when I'm driving country roads for work and the radio starts picking up those strange conversations, I hear my own voice mixed in with the others, talking about the weather, asking about the children, discussing how much I love living in that beautiful old house on Sorrow Creek Road. And I know that part of me never really left that place. Part of me is still sitting at that dinner table, wearing clothes from 1985, learning what it means to be family. The worst part is, in those dreams, I'm happy. I'm finally home. I'm 52 years old and I've been doing pest control for about 15 years now. Started the business after my divorce when I needed steady work that could pay the bills. Most calls are pretty routine. Ants, roaches, maybe some mice in the winter. But I got this one call last October that still keeps me up at night. And honestly, I don't usually let work follow me home. The woman on the phone was elderly, maybe in her 90s, and she spoke so quietly I had to press the phone hard against my ear. Said her name was Mrs. Blackwood, and she had a severe infestation at her place out in Oldham County, Kentucky. When I asked what kind of pests we were dealing with, there was this long pause. Then she whispered, "It's wearing my husband's face." I figured she was confused, maybe had dementia or something. Old folks sometimes see things that aren't there, especially when they're isolated. But she was paying cash, $500 up front, and the address she gave me was way out in the sticks. The kind of job that pays well because nobody else wants to drive that far. So I told her I'd be out the next morning. The drive took almost 2 hours through winding mountain roads that cut through Daniel Boone National Forest. GPS kept losing signal after I passed Cave City, so I had to use an old paper map I keep in the truck. The Blackwood place was at the end of a long gravel drive surrounded by maybe 100 acres of forest, but as I got closer, I noticed something was wrong with the trees. Every single one had strips of red cloth tied to the branches, fluttering in the wind like warning flags. And there were these stone cairns lining both sides of the driveway, maybe 20 of them, each one topped with what looked like a different wedding ring catching the morning sunlight. The house itself was this massive Victorian mansion, probably built in the 1890s when coal money was flow, wing through eastern Kentucky. 3 stories with a wraparound porch and all these ornate gingerbread details that were mostly rotted away now. Paint was peeling everywhere and half the shutters were hanging crooked. It was the kind of place that screamed old money once upon a time, but had been left to decay for decades. The foundation stones were local limestone, stained black with age and moisture. I parked next to the front steps and grabbed my inspection kit. Usually I start by walking the perimeter, looking for entry points and signs of activity. But right away I could tell this wasn't going to be a normal job. There were no insects anywhere, no ants on the porch, no spider webs in the corners, not even any flies buzzing around the overgrown flower beds. In my experience, old houses like this are usually crawling with something. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring, like being in a soundproof room. Even stranger, there were no birds. October in Kentucky, you should hear crows, maybe some late-season songbirds. Nothing. Just this heavy quiet that seemed to press down on everything. The air felt thick, almost oily, and had this metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. I knocked on the front door and waited. After a few minutes, I heard this scraping sound from inside, like metal being dragged across hardwood floors. The door opened and there was Mrs. Blackwood in an old wheelchair. She was tiny, maybe 90 pounds, soaking wet, with white hair pulled back in a bun and these pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. But here's what bothered me. The wheelchair had these deep scratches gouged into the armrests, like someone with very long fingernails had been gripping them. "You're the pest man," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Carol Jenkins from Mountain Pest Solutions. You called about an infestation?" She nodded and wheeled backward so I could come in. The inside of the house was dark and smelled like old wood, and something else I couldn't place at first. Something chemical and sweet like formaldehyde, mixed with pine sap and something organic that had been preserved too long. The furniture was all antiques, covered in dust sheets, and there were family portraits lining the walls going back generations. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed that several of the portraits had been scratched out, like someone had taken their fingernails to the canvas faces. "Tell me about the problem you're having," I said, setting down my kit. Mrs. Blackwood wheeled over to the window and pointed outside toward a small family cemetery at the edge of the property. "My husband died 5 years ago. He's buried right there under that oak tree, but someone wearing his face comes to visit me every night." I looked where she was pointing and could see a headstone with Harold Blackwood, 1925 to 2019 carved into it. The grass around it was dead in a perfect circle, maybe 10 feet across, like something had poisoned the earth itself. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said gently, "I think you might need to call someone else, maybe a doctor or—" "Look at this," she interrupted, wheeling over to a photo album on the coffee table. She flipped it open to wedding pictures from what looked like the 1940s. But as she turned the pages, showing me photos from different decades, anniversaries, holidays, family gatherings, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The man's face was different in every single picture. Same body, same clothes, same posture, but the facial features kept changing. Different nose, different jawline, different eyes, like someone had been carefully swapping faces. "That's not possible," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Harold was born with a birthmark here," she said, pointing to her left cheek. "But look, it moves around in the pictures. Sometimes it's not there at all." She was right. In some photos, the mark was on the right side. In others, it was on his forehead. In the most recent ones, there was no birthmark at all. "He visits every night around sunset," she whispered. "Brings me dead animals arranged in heart shapes. Thinks it's romantic. Tries to kiss me with a mouth that opens the wrong way. And his skin." She shuddered. "It's always cold. Like touching meat that's been in the refrigerator." I was about to make an excuse and leave when she showed me something on her phone. Security camera footage from the night before. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. In the grainy black and white video, I watched a man walk across the front porch. But instead of using the door, he walked straight through the solid wood like it was made of mist. My hands started shaking. "How is that possible?" "I need you to find where it's hiding during the day," she said. "And I need you to make it stop. It's been getting bolder, touching me while I sleep, whispering about how pretty my face will look in its collection." Against every instinct I had, I agreed to do a full inspection. Something about the desperation in her voice, the genuine terror in those pale blue eyes, made me believe her. And if I'm being honest, the professional part of me was curious. In 15 years of pest control, I'd never encountered anything like this. I started in the basement and worked my way up. The basement was your typical old house foundation: fieldstone walls, dirt floor, low ceiling with exposed joists. But right away, I found things that didn't make sense. There were no signs of typical pests, but I kept finding human hair in the air vents. Long strands in different colors and textures, some of it clearly from different decades based on the styling product residue. Under the floorboards in the living room, I discovered fingernail clippings arranged in these elaborate spiral patterns like mandalas made from keratin. Some of the clippings were yellow with age, others looked fresh. The crawl space was worse. It was full of what looked like shed skin. Thin, translucent sheets that were roughly human-shaped but way too big, like someone had molted out of bodies that were 7 or 8 feet tall. Some of the pieces still had facial features molded into them like masks that had been peeled off and discarded. When I touched one with my flashlight, it crumbled like old parchment, and the smell that rose up was that same chemical sweet odor from upstairs, concentrated until it was almost nauseating. By the time I got to the attic, my flashlight was starting to flicker and my phone had no signal. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed up into the dusty space under the eaves. The air up there was different, colder, and with a pressure that made my ears pop like I was climbing a mountain. That's where I found the collection. The entire back wall of the attic was lined with faces mounted like hunting trophies. Not masks, actual preserved human faces, with the skin and muscle tissue intact. Each one had been carefully removed and treated with some kind of preservation process that kept them looking fresh. They hung from small hooks, and each had a little brass nameplate underneath with a date and name. The oldest one I could see was dated 1847. Jeremiah Cole. The newest was from 2019, Harold Blackwood. I counted 47 faces in total. Men, women, even a few children. All of them had their eyes closed except for one, a young woman from 1923 whose nameplate read Mary Henderson. Her eyes were open and seemed to track my movement as I walked along the wall. In the far corner, hanging on a special hook by itself, was Harold Blackwood's face. It looked exactly like the man in Mrs. Blackwood's wedding photos, down to the birthmark on his left cheek. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The face was breathing. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, but the nostrils were flaring in and out like it was still alive. That's when I heard footsteps on the roof above me. Heavy, deliberate steps that moved in that same wrong rhythm I'd heard described. Like someone who had learned to walk by watching others but couldn't quite get the timing right. I dropped my flashlight, and it rolled across the floor, the beam spinning and casting crazy shadows on all those preserved faces. For just a moment, in the strobing light, I could swear they were all looking at me. Some looked peaceful, like they were sleeping. Others had expressions of pure terror frozen on their features, and Mary Henderson's face seemed to mouth the word, "Run." I grabbed my flashlight and got out of that attic as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Mrs. Blackwood was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, and I could see from her expression that she knew what I'd found. "It's almost sunset," she said quietly, glancing at the grandfather clock in the hallway. 5:47 p.m. Through the window, I watched the sun disappear behind the tree line. The temperature in the house seemed to drop 10 degrees all at once, and that chemical smell got stronger, almost overwhelming. Then I heard the front door creak open downstairs. "Hello, darling," called a man's voice from the foyer. It sounded warm and loving, but there was something wrong with it, like the words had been recorded separately and spliced together. The cadence was off, with weird pauses between syllables. Mrs. Blackwood gripped the arms of her wheelchair so hard her knuckles went white. "That's him. That's Harold's voice, but it's not Harold." Heavy footsteps crossed the hardwood floor below us, moving with that strange rhythm that sounded like someone who had too many joints in their legs. Each step had this wet, sliding quality, like bare feet on a bathroom floor. "I brought you something special tonight, my love," the voice called out, and I could hear the excitement in it, the kind of anticipation a child has wowed. Hen giving a present. Mrs. Blackwood wheeled to the window and pointed down at the front yard. Arranged on the brown grass in a perfect heart shape were maybe 30 dead rabbits, their white fur bright in the moonlight. But they hadn't just been killed. They'd been posed, arranged with their little paws folded over their chests like they were sleeping. In the center of the heart was a dead cat, and written in its blood on the ground were the words, "For my beloved." The footsteps started up the stairs. I could hear breathing that was too deep and too slow, like someone manually controlling their lungs. With each breath came that smell, formaldehyde and pine sap and something else, something rotten underneath the preservation chemicals. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. But Mrs. Blackwood shook her head. "It only comes at night, and it only comes for me. If you run, it'll follow." The thing wearing Harold Blackwood's face appeared at the top of the stairs. It looked perfect, exactly like the preserved face I'd seen in the attic, down to the birthmark and the kind eyes. But the skin was too tight in some places and too loose in others, especially around the hairline where I could see the edges where it had been attached. When it smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp, I could see that the mouth opened vertically instead of horizontally, like a wound splitting open. "Hello, Carol," it said in Harold's voice, tilting its head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be human. "I've been watching you explore my home. You found my collection." The way it said collection made my stomach turn. There was pride in its voice, like an artist showing off their work. I backed against the wall, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What do you want?" "I want what I've always wanted," it said, looking at Mrs. Blackwood with eyes that didn't blink often enough. The pupils were wrong, too large, like a nocturnal animal's. "To be with my beloved wife, to add her beautiful face to my family." It moved toward her with that wrong gait, arms reaching out. But now I could see why the movement was so disturbing. The thing's limbs were too long, with extra joints that bent in directions that human bones couldn't accommodate. Its fingers were like spider legs, each one ending in a sharp, yellowed nail that was easily 3 inches long. Mrs. Blackwood recoiled in her wheelchair, and I could see tears streaming down her face. "You're not Harold," she whispered. "Of course I am," it said, and pulled out a piece of paper from its jacket pocket. "I even wrote you a love letter, just like I used to." The handwriting was perfect, exactly like the samples Mrs. Blackwood had shown me from Harold's old letters. But the words were in the wrong order, like someone had cut sentences apart and rearranged them randomly. "Darling, my face, you're beautiful, soon will be mine. Always, Love forever, Harold together, will be in my special place. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze completely. The thing's body temperature was all wrong. I could see my breath in the air around it, like standing next to an open freezer. But worse than that, I could smell what was underneath Harold's face. Something putrid and sweet, like meat that had been left out in the sun for weeks. I remembered the shed skin in the crawl space and the collection of faces in the attic, and suddenly, I understood what I was dealing with. This thing had been stealing identities for over a century, learning to impersonate people after they died. But it was getting impatient with Mrs. Blackwood. It wanted her face while she was still alive, while it was still fresh. "I need to check my equipment outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while I backed toward the stairs. The thing's head snapped toward me with a motion like a bird of prey. "You're not going anywhere, Carol. You've seen my collection. You know my secret." It smiled that vertical smile again. "But I like you. You could join my family. I could wear your face sometimes. Live your life. Wouldn't that be nice?" But I was already moving, pushing past it toward the stairs. The moment I touched its arm, ice-cold pain shot through my hand like frostbite. I heard Mrs. Blackwood scream behind me as I ran down to the first floor and out the front door, my feet slipping on the porch boards that were slick with some kind of moisture I didn't want to identify. I made it to my truck and grabbed the industrial-strength pesticide tanks from the back, the stuff we use for serious infestations that can clear out entire buildings. But I also grabbed something else, a road flare from my emergency kit. If this thing was as old as I thought it was, if it had been collecting faces since the 1800s, then maybe fire would work where chemicals wouldn't. When I got back inside, the thing had dropped its Harold Blackwood disguise completely. What I saw made me wish I'd kept driving and never looked back. It was impossibly tall, maybe 8 feet, and so thin it looked like a praying mantis that had learned to walk upright. Its real skin was pale gray and slightly translucent, like old wax paper, and I could see dark veins pulsing underneath. Where its face should have been was just smooth skin stretched over a skull, with 2 holes for nostrils and a vertical slit where its mouth was. Its arms reached almost to the floor, and those spider-leg fingers were wrapped around Mrs. Blackwood's wheelchair. But the worst part was the sound it was making, a low humming that seemed to come from inside its chest, like a tuning fork vibrating in a cathedral. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur. "Your face," it said, but now its voice was coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls. "Your face will be perfect for my collection." "Stop," I yelled, and opened both pesticide tanks at once while lighting the road flare. The chemical fog filled the room in seconds, and the moment the fumes hit the creature, it let out a shriek that sounded like metal being torn apart. It released Mrs. Blackwood and stumbled backward, that gray skin starting to bubble and smoke where the chemicals touched it. But before it could escape, I threw the burning flare into the pesticide cloud. The explosion knocked me flat and blew out every window on the first floor. When the smoke cleared, the creature was gone, but so was Harold's face from where it had been hanging on a hook by the door. I could see a trail of that gray, translucent fluid leading to the broken window. Not quite blood, not quite anything else. I helped Mrs. Blackwood outside and called 911. The paramedics said she was in shock, but physically unharmed. She moved to a nursing home in Louisville the next week and died peacefully in her sleep about a month later. I thought that was the end of it. But at her funeral, I saw Harold's face in the crowd. It was on a young man's body this time, maybe 20 years old, standing at the back of the church. When our eyes met, it smiled that same loving smile Harold had given Mrs. Blackwood in all those wedding photos. Then it mouthed the words, "Thank you," and pointed at Mrs. Blackwood's casket. I burned the Blackwood mansion down 3 days later. Told the fire department it was an electrical problem from my equipment malfunctioning. But when the flames reached the attic where all those preserved faces were stored, I swear I could hear them screaming, not in pain, but in relief, like they were finally being set free. The local newspaper ran a story about the fire, mentioned that it was the 3rd time the house had burned down. Apparently it had been destroyed in 1847 and again in 1923, the same years I'd seen on those nameplates in the attic. Each time, It had been rebuilt by surviving family members who claimed they needed to keep the collection safe. I still get calls sometimes from Mrs. Black, Wood's old number. When I answer, there's just breathing on the other end, that same too deep, too slow rhythm I heard in the house. And sometimes, very quietly, I hear her voice whisper, "It's wearing my face now. It's learning to be me." I don't do pest control anymore, sold the business and moved to Florida, as far from those Kentucky mountains as I could get. But sometimes when I'm walking on the beach at sunset, I see faces in the crowd that look familiar, faces I remember from that attic wall. And I know that thing is still out there, still collecting, still learning to be human. Some infestations you just can't get rid of. They just spread.